Hello, and welcome to Rolling Out's Book of the Week with our author, Morgan Harper Nichols, who's an acclaimed artist, poet, musician, and Wall Street Journal and Publishers Weekly best-selling author. Welcome to the show, Morgan Harper Nichols.
Hello. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
It's definitely a pleasure. Um, I got a chance to get a copy of your book, How Far You've Come, but that's not the only book that you've authored, right?
Yeah,
Um, so,
yeah,
so
I have a few. Yes. I started I did a self-published book back in 2017, a book of poetry, and then my book All Along You Are Blooming that came out in 2020, January of 2020. So, yes, lots of poetry out there in book form.
yes, absolutely. So I want to get started with talking about your book, but in doing my research about you, you're so many other things, right? So you're a musician as well. You're
I
an
am.
entrepreneur. You have all of these things going on. And we'll get into those later. But let's start with how far you've come. What was the inspiration behind it, and what is the book about?
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to write this book last year. And right when I started working on it, it was right at the beginning of the first lockdown. And it was just such an odd time to do anything during that time, and let alone write a book. I was like, how do you write a book? And when we don't know what's ahead, like when you're writing a book, you're writing for a publishing date sometime in the future. So it was very much so of like, well, what do I know to be true in this time where so much about the future is uncertain? What do I know to be true? And the answer to that question was I had to look at my own life, and it was, well, I already know how far I've come. Like, I don't know what's ahead, but I already know that there's courage and strength and beauty in my story. So what I started doing was I started looking at my iPhone's camera roll, and I started going back and looking at moments of my life. And the cover of the book is actually from a road trip taken on my iPhone when I was riding through Albuquerque, New Mexico at sunrise one morning. And I started to find all these moments in my life where I was on this beautiful landscape, but at the same time, I was facing some uncertainty or some question, and I was growing in courage at the same time. So I just got really excited about looking at my own story in that way. And I just hope that, the poems can kind of help other people do that too, because I think that there's so much richness already in our stories. So yeah, that's a little bit of what it's about and how it came to be.
So tell us about this photo. Where was
Yes.
it, and how did you select this one to be the book cover?
Yeah. So, yeah, I took this. I was in the passenger seat. This is back when I was a touring musician. We were on the road. It was super early in the morning, and we were leaving Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I think the interstate is I-40. And the sunrise at that moment was just so beautiful to me because, like, the way it just illuminated the rock faces of the canyons, it was just such a beautiful moment, like on the interstate. And I grew up in Atlanta, so I'm not used to, like, on the interstate where I grew up in Atlanta, it's lots of trees. So I wasn't used to this, like, this vast open space that just really drew me in.
Yeah.
And from that photo, I just fell in love with it. And I got into digital art years later, and I started pulling color palettes from that photo. So it's just been a special photo in my life. And when I was just flipping through, going all the way back on my phone's camera roll, it was there. And I was like, I think there's something more to this photo. I think that there's a reason why I keep coming back to it, why I love these colors. And I think it's more than just the aesthetics. And what made me pick it as the cover was when I started to think about what was going on in my life when I took that photo, because I was like, at that point in my life, I was probably struggling the most financially that I've ever struggled. And it was like the most, like, life just feels like a dead end. Like, I just feel like every day is a struggle. Every day is refreshing the bank account. Like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get it? How am I going to get through? So it just made me think about, wow, it's so fascinating how these two things can happen at once, where I'm content and I'm in this beautiful environment and I'm so satisfied with what I'm seeing, but internally I'm having to learn how to trust and I'm having to learn how to pace myself. So yeah, that photo for me just really reflected a lot of that for me. And I was like, okay, I always pick the cover based on something that's meaningful to me, because I get in my head a lot and I'm like, oh, what if people don't like it? What if everyone hates it? And then I have to say, like, but you know what? So make it something that is true to you and true to your story. So that way I can stand behind it. So yeah, I was super proud and happy when my publisher agreed with my idea for the cover. I was like, yay. And that's how it came to be. So straight from the iPhone to the cover of the book.
Listen, you can do a whole movie on your iPhone now.
Oh,
So
yeah,
yeah.
you
So,
can. Yes.
so the subtitle is Musings on Beauty and Courage. And then all of the chapters, aside from the introduction, are the names of states. How
Mhm.
did you come up with that? And give us one of your favorite stories, I guess, from one of these states. Like, which one would you say is your favorite?
Yeah. So oh gosh, yeah. So I when I took that, so it's so crazy how it really is all kind of let one thing led to another. So with the cover, I was like, okay, I've got a theme here. There's a road. Maybe it's something about a road trip. How far do you come? Like, I think this ties together. So I started thinking about, I'm like, well, let me think about some road trips that I've taken in my life. And the one that stood out to me the most was when I was 6 years old and my family, we drove from Atlanta, where we lived, to Los Angeles, where my dad's family's from and where I was actually born. I grew up in Atlanta, but I was born in California. And as a kid, and I still love California, but as a kid, I was just like, all I wanted to do was get to California. I was like, there's a beach there, there's palm trees. I just wanted to go to California.
Fun,
Even,
right?
yeah, at 6 years old, which is so funny because like back then, I mean, we didn't have like the internet. Like I just the little pieces of it that I had, I was like, I just want to get back there.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, that road trip, that 1996 road trip, it really set the tone for the rest of the book, because I realized I was like, wait a second, I have a story or some big life moment in every single state from Georgia all the way to California.
Wow.
Because I've traveled a lot with music, I've lived in different states, I went to college in different places. I was like, wow, I really have like physically traveled so far. And that was just that alone, like choosing to write about each of those states, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and thinking about my time in those places. And some of those moments were fleeting. It just was such a healing moment of just
Mhm.
recognizing how far I've come, and not just on like a emotional level or a psychological level, but also just like a physical level. It's like we have physically traveled so many miles.
Yeah.
And speaking of miles, one of the chapters that really kind of uh, carries the weight of that feeling, I would say, is the Mississippi chapter. And that chapter is pretty significant for me. It's the only chapter of the book where all the art in this chapter is black and white. So the book is full color, except for the Mississippi chapter. It's all black and white. And the reason why is because I'm telling a story when I was taking that road trip as a kid and we were driving through Mississippi at night. And around that time, my mom is an educator and we were homeschooled. And she's still like this. Like anywhere we're driving, she's like, "Oh, that happened over there, in 1862. Like that's a part of history." And she was always very much so wanting my sister and I to know about history, even at a young age.
Mhm.
So as we were driving through Mississippi, I was aware, even as a kid, that like of where we were driving through. I was like, "Oh, we're in like major plantation territory,
Mhm.
just in terms of where we were driving through." And I was aware that even me, that as a kid, that I'm a descendant of slaves who could have very well have been on one of these plantations. And as a kid, I struggled with that reality, as
Mhm.
most of us, as we all do, and learning about that for the first time. And at the same time, I had so much hope for when I started hearing stories about runaways and the slaves that were run away. And I had this vision when we were driving through Mississippi, and I write about this in that chapter, of a young slave girl escaping with her mom. And I could literally almost see her like running parallel to me in the car. And I even get chills as I say it now.
I did
And
too.
I just, for me, I'm like, for me as a little girl to have been able to put that together, to hear this horrific history that's obviously has not, is still going on in different ways, but to hear this horrific history, but at the same time, like I just had a little bit of hope, a little bit of hope for a little girl like me that she could know freedom.
Wow.
Um, and I tend to get very cynical as an adult. So I always want to hold on to that. I want that part of myself to stay, like that little Morgan that was like, but what about the ones who escaped? Like maybe somebody, they were able to cross that Mississippi River. They were able to be free. They were able to escape. So yeah, that's just a really special chapter for me. That was one that I put in the book. I was like, I don't know how other people will respond to this, but
Yeah.
for me, I was like, it has to be here because I was like, this is something I need in my life, especially after the kind of year and a half we've had. It's so hard to have hopeful imagination for the future at times.
Yeah.
Um, and yet children really do remind us that that's still possible. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's definitely a very special chapter for me.
What an amazing and vivid story. Thank you for sharing that. And as you said, you were getting chills. I was getting chills at the same
Mhm.
time. And so I really felt that. Let's talk about California. You said California. So I'm from California. I was born and
Oh,
raised in
awesome.
California in San
Yeah.
Francisco. And I know you were talking about, I believe you said LA. You guys.
Yeah, Long Beach. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was born in Long Beach.
Okay, you about to get me in here with Snoop.
Yes,
Snoop Dogg.
yes. Yeah.
Okay. So California, let's talk about
Mhm.
the California chapter. It's ironically the last chapter in the book.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was by design. Tell us why and what was memorable about California and why you had to end the book on that
Mhm.
chapter.
Yes. So and yeah, I kind of mentioned before, as a little kid, I had this fascination with going west. I was just like, I don't know why, I just feel drawn to the west. Um, and interestingly enough, even like the migration story of like how my family ended up getting from Texas to California is just a very similar of like, I don't know, maybe there's just possibility here. Like, let's just go, let's see what's out there. So in some ways I think like on an ancestral level, it's just kind of in me, like, let's just go west, let's just see what's out there.
Mhm.
And I just love I mean, I love the weather. I love, and I know that sounds so cliche, but
No.
I think weather has like, I think people really underestimate how much weather can affect our moods and our environments. And I always joke, but I'm not really joking. I'm like, hey, my DNA says I am mostly African. I was made for the sun, okay? I
Listen,
wasn't made for weeks and weeks of cloudy days. I
absolutely.
was like, I
Right.
admire people who can do it, but I am not one of those.
Right.
So just the weather alone was just so calming for me. And it still is today. Being outside in fresh air is huge for me. One thing I didn't know, and I learned this as I was writing the book, is that I'm actually autistic. I was diagnosed with autism. And yeah, things like being outside in fresh air really do help me regulate emotionally. So I think even as a kid, I was picking up on that. And the biggest significance that that California chapter has and why I had to end there is because starting with that trip in Georgia, I did make it to California. And that was actually where I truly believe that I kind of like received like the go ahead to pursue art.
Mhm.
And it happened because my parents are preachers and my dad was preaching in California. And I'd write about this in the book that I was drawing notes for my dad's sermon. And then later on, I showed it to my dad, and my dad looked at me and said, God created you to create.
Mhm.
And that happened in South Central, where my dad grew up. We're at my grandma's house. And I still remember that moment so clearly. So California just ended up becoming, and like not even the touristy part, like we're literally in the neighborhood where my dad grew up. Like it became very central to like, okay, maybe I can go west. Maybe I can go beyond like what I think is possible. Maybe these drawings in my notebook don't have to stay in my notebook.
Right.
And it ended up being 20 years later that I moved to California, and that's where I started to experiment with art, and I became an artist. So yeah, I'm obsessed with location and how location can influence different parts of our story and what the landscape itself can teach us. And yeah, that's just a part of how that why that chapter had to kind of but why the book had to kind of end in that chapter, because it really was like, okay, you've come so far, now let's kick it into gear, let's make this art and get it out there.
I love it, love it, love it. You just mentioned that you learned that you were diagnosed with autism at 31. I think it was last year,
Yeah.
right?
It was
Um,
this year.
it was
Well,
this
it's
year.
I'm sorry. I started the diagnosis process last year, and then it ended this year. So you're right. Yeah,
Okay.
it started last
Okay.
year.
So let's talk about that briefly. I was reading where you had doctor's appointments and you would ask your doctor, am I autistic? And they dismissed it. And one of the things that you said in your heartfelt post was you wish you wouldn't have listened to him. What
Mhm.
were some of the signs that led you to believe that you may have been autistic?
Hmm. Yeah, so I always felt like I had to put in a lot of work to kind of just communicate with other people. I would even just hanging out with friends, like I would rehearse certain conversation points or jokes or ideas before I would even hang out with people. And it got more and more complex in terms of like as friendships grew deeper, or even in marriage with my husband, of just feeling like I had to put in so much work and time and energy into picking up on, like, I don't necessarily like really read facial expressions very well, so I try to like pick up on other cues and try to figure out. And I was just like, I feel like I'm working overtime like all the time, even when I'm with people who I've known my whole life. And I think when I was in my teen years, I was like, maybe I'll just get the hang of it eventually. But by the time I got to the doctor, I was like in my late 20s. And I was like, it's not going away. Like I'm an actual grown up now, and I still feel like I'm not. There's just a part that's not clicking. And then I I wouldn't have used this language then because I didn't know what it was, but I had a lot of like unease around like loud sounds or bright
Mhm.
lights, and I just didn't know why. Like I would usually think maybe I'm just sleep deprived, but I'm like, I'm not always sleep deprived. Like, what is this? So just my mom had been Googling years ago, and she had actually asked the doctor when I was a kid, but they just kind of wrote it off, and they were like, no, she's not autistic, nothing to worry about. And so I knew that that was something my mom had looked up. So that's
Mhm.
why I asked my doctor in my late 20s. I was like, I think I could be autistic. And I mean, he just shot me down. Like before he could even hear my case, if you will, he was just like, you're perfectly normal. You have nothing to worry about. Like he didn't even make eye contact. He didn't even look up from his clipboard. He was just like, why are you bothering me with this? And
Wow.
sadly, I took his word. I literally walked out of that doctor's office like, okay, he's the expert. I guess it's just on me to fix.
Yeah.
So I traveled a few more years, just kind of struggling with the same thing, just thinking that I started going to therapy, which I still go to therapy,
Mhm.
but just unable to really put the pieces together, and just kind of assuming that it was just my fault to fix, and something that I did wrong and I just need to fix it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I ended up seeing some TikTok videos. The algorithm showed me some TikTok videos last year of some women who had been diagnosed as adults, and that's when I was like, they're describing my whole life. um, I got to seek some help. And thankfully I was able to find a specialist who specialize in seeing adult women. And it is just yeah, it changed my life. It just
Yeah.
gave me, oh yeah, it changed
Such
everything for me.
such a powerful story, and thank you for sharing, because I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who will take your story after hearing it and want to do something for themselves as well when it comes to advocating for themselves, making sure that
Yeah.
they're pushing. That's really big. It's really big. So, and I commend you. Like, I am such in awe of you and who you become, and you're an artist and you're a poet and you're a musician. And I know we got about 3 more minutes, and I hate to ask you this, but we have to know about your music and your artists and the other things that you're doing before you go.
Yes, well, thank you so much for just, kind of even just reflecting my own story back to me. Thank you so much. And yeah, I just love trying stuff. I love making art, and I have an online shop called Garden 24 where you can find a lot of it. We have journals, planners, stickers, and you can actually see some of it behind me. I make tons of art, and I also make music art as well. I have a sister who's a producer. Her name's Jamie Grace, and she and I are working on music right now. And we've got some stuff coming. I am so excited about it. So yeah, I consider myself really blessed that I just get to work on art and try a lot of different things. And most of the time it comes out some kind of poetry or
Yeah.
music or art. So
I
yeah.
love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Last question of the day. If you could have people walk away with one message from your book, How Far You've Come, what would it be and why?
Hmm. It would be that there is so much richness to your story that you may not even know. There are things that you've lived through and have experienced, and you have only scratched the surface. So just dare to take that time and know that you're worth it, to really spend that time honoring your journey and honoring your story, because there's so much to your story, and you really have come so far. And when you look back, you'll see it.
I love that. Thank you so much for stopping by, rolling out, Morgan. We appreciate you very, very much. Tell us where we can find you, where we can find shop with you, where we can find more information, your music, and all of that.
Yes, yes. Well, I try to keep it really easy. If you go to morganharpernichols.com, I have a link there that says new book. I have a link for my podcast, my shop, my app, my YouTube channel where my music is. So it's just kind of the hub for all the things. And obviously the social links are on there as well. So yeah, morganharpernichols.com.
Thank you so much. I'm your host, Portia Monique, and it was definitely a pleasure speaking with you. Take care, and we'll
Likewise.
follow you on your journey. Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.